Walking through aggressive stage 3 ovarian cancer was terrifying, number one. And I knew in the bottom of my heart that there was something else there. There was something that I hadn't quite figured out, which was probably a trigger. I could feel it. And when I started studying the work of Dr. Hammer in German New Medicine, and an offshoot is recall healing and total biology, this work that he created, he mapped out areas of the brain that tie to different organs and glands, and then he also correlated different types of traumas. He was an oncologist, different types of traumas with different types of cancer or different types of disease. So what he discovered was that when there's been a shock or a trauma in your life, it'll hit the brain, the body, and the psyche all simultaneously. And then that will affect the biology. And the biology will run these programs in an effort to help us survive, to get us through this trauma, to get us through this stress. We ultimately want to try to resolve these traumas and move on. But sometimes they follow us around our whole entire lives, and then we can't understand why we're always depressed, or we've got something chronically wrong with us. And it begins with a shock or a trauma that we take on. So for me, it was when I was 3 years old, and I was taken away pretty much violently in the middle of the night from my father. My mother ran off, took the 4 kids, and ran off with another man. And that registered on my brain as a 3-year-old as a loss conflict and a separation conflict from my father. Hey, how is a 3-year-old supposed to resolve that? You know, she's just going along with what her mother said. So my brain actually had a mark, and I've done my brain scan twice. And you can see on a brain scan, you can see these marks. They look like tree rings. And each of those rings on your brain represent a specific trauma. And when you know the mapping of the brain, you can read that brain scan almost like a psychic reading. I actually had mine read. And she said, first of all, congratulations, it's not coming back, meaning the cancer. And I was like, I need to know why. And then and then she told me all about myself based upon my brain scan. She could tell what kind of traumas I had, and it was fascinating. So I had to figure it out. And so I've been trying to disprove it for years, and, you know, Dr. Hammer was right on the money. And so there have been extensions of his work that are also really valid, recall healing, total biology. And I use this work in my practice every single day, because for every disease there is a shock or a series of shocks and traumas, and we have to get to those, unravel them, free the brain, and even more than that, we're freeing the inner child that was hurt, because many times these patterns will follow us around our whole entire lives in an effort to try to resolve them. Our brain keeps replaying this like Groundhog Day, trying to get a resolution. And literally, we can make a timeline, and we can find this pattern and go through your whole life if something is unresolved. Now, here's the thing, is when you've got this shock or this conflict, and it's sitting on your brain, and as a 3-year-old, I didn't even realize it was there. What happens is one of two things. Either your tissue or your organs are either breaking down into microperforations, or you're building a massive tissue. Because your brain thinks you need to do that in order to survive. It's the automatic brain in charge of your survival. So as my ovary broke down for 43 years, didn't see my dad for 43 years, this lost conflict, you know, it must have looked like Swiss cheese. And then all those years later, when I finally met him, and my brain said she has her daddy back, my brain said, oh, that trauma is over, and it sent amino acids to this area of my brain, healed it on the brain, and you can see how on the brain scan it's healed. It looks like a white circle instead of a tree ring. So it healed here, and then it sent a signal to my right ovary that had been breaking down all those years, and it said it's time to heal the ovary. So it filled with fluid, and the longer you hold a trauma, and the more intense that trauma is, the bigger this healing phase is going to be. So it fills with fluid, and my tumor grew to be about this big. And then tentacles came out from the tumor to go out to get nutrition to bring it back to heal it. And after a certain point, 6 months, they retracted, and then it died from the inside out. When you resolve a lost conflict like that, and it involves your ovary, it takes 9 months for it to heal. Just like it takes 9 months to make a baby from an ovary, from an egg. So I grew this huge tumor, and I listened to my heart about when I should go into the doctor. And I went in at the right time. I had them remove it, and it was already dying from the inside out. So I had it taken out at the right time. Now, if I would have gone in 6 months prior, they would have found tentacles all around my organs. And they would have sewed me up, and they would have sent me home to die. But I listened. I paid attention. And it was, kind of a gutsy thing to do. And then I refused chemo. They wanted me to do chemo, but there was no way I was going to do that because I knew inside not to do it. So,
where do you think you would be today if you did it?
I'd be dead.
How do you know that?
I just know it. I knew it. If I would have done chemo, it would have killed me.
Why?
I just felt it. It was so deep. There would have been no chance of me walking into a chemo center to get chemo. I mean, you'd have to straitjacket me and sedate me to get me in there. That's how strongly I felt about not doing it. So when I was 26 years old, I watched my mother die from cancer treatment. Breast cancer, bone cancer, liver cancer. Each of those is a different conflict, by the way. So she had breast cancer, and that was a conflict over the house. So then she felt devalued about having surgery and all this, and then that's the conflict of bone cancer. And then she had a survival conflict, and that was her liver cancer. Each type of cancer has a different emotional conflict. So when the doctor says to you, you've got stage 4 ovarian cancer, is what he told me. And I saw this coffin right away, and the room spun.
Stage 4?
That's what he said, but then when they took it out, it was 3.
Mm-hmm.
He could have given me another conflict, a survival conflict right then and there, a shock. But somehow I managed not to go down that road. And I listened very, very carefully to what I needed to do. I was terrified, of course, but there were times of peace and where I could get a handle on it. But I've found that this work is really right on the money, and that there's always an emotional trigger to any type of disease. And depression comes along with any kind of a diagnosis. There's always a depression, because if you're slightly depressed or you're depressed, the brain says, well, this person will be easier to care for because they're not fighting you along the way. So this depression is kind of helping them to be cared for.
So if somebody has depression or anxiety, and let's start with depression. If somebody's in that state right now, can you help them identify where some of these experiences may have originated, help guide them back into childhood where these feelings started first getting experienced, and then you could even go back further into the womb and help them to put together a picture of what was happening, obviously without blame and judgment, but to understand how the fight or flight process began, and this self-reflection and how we perceive those events, how the person perceived the events that were happening, and has created a story out of that which is still being played and that needs to be resolved, and to help take them back to there to identify their surrounding factors and how to kind of understand it.
Right, so the surrounding factors with depression, it's having to do with conflicts and disputes and arguments within your territory, within your home. Did your parents fight a lot? Did your grandparents fight a lot? Were you allowed to have your own territory? And if you aren't allowed to have your own territory, then that can lead you into frustration. It can lead you into devaluation and guilt, and therefore depression. I think of the word frustration, and I think that equals depression. So if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling devalued, and and then you're feeling guilty, that's a recipe for depression. And it's unresolved from childhood typically. Now, sometimes you can take on stuff from your mother and stuff from your father while you're in utero developing. And then it becomes what's called your project purpose, to finish their unresolved stuff for them. And you're like, where did this depression come from? It's just been a chronic depression your whole entire life. Well, you might be trying to resolve it for your parents. And some of the keys to getting yourself out of depression are to be looking forward into the future. A lot of people who are stuck in depression, they're stuck in the past. And it may not even be your own past. It might be your parents' past. Look into your family tree. Who else had depression? Were you named after somebody who was depressed? Their unfinished business gets passed down through the line. And so then it ends up on your shoulders, and it can even be magnified. So by not living in the past and always having goals in the future, and I'm not just talking about just a basic goal, I mean really specific goals. Like in 1 month, I want to accomplish this. In 6 months, I want to accomplish this specific thing. And then you go out a year and 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. That is the key to getting out of depression, is to always be moving forward. It's when we get stuck in the past, that's when we stay frustrated and devalued and guilty and depressed. So there's a way that we can actually help you to see where that depression came from and see if it came from you or if it got passed down through the generations. And we do that by doing a timelining exercise.